everyone. Can you hear me okay in the back? Perfect, thank you. All right, so we'll get started if you all want to find a seat quickly. Okay, so first, I started the Brown Bag series saying thank you, and I want to end it saying thank you to the large group of people who helped put this together. So thank you to National, especially for Claire, for helping set where you're sitting up. Thank you to IT for setting up all our technology issues and everything that goes along with that, because I could not handle it. Thank you to our marketing department, especially Jen, Kendra, Justin, and Meg, who's out there at the moment. But thank you for helping me promote this event and getting everything organized for it. Thank you to the athletic department, especially Courtney, for helping set up our streaming services. And then finally, thank you to the Harlan-Lincoln House Executive Committee for all your help with this. So now I'll get on to the main course. Again, my name is Madison Pullis. I'm the director of the Harlan-Lincoln House. And today I'm very excited to introduce our Brown Bag lecturer, Rich Hileman. So Rich was born and raised in Des Moines. He graduated from St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota with majors in English and philosophy, and also received an MA in philosophy and a JD from the University of Iowa. Rich is a retired lawyer, though his wife got him interested in genealogy around 1980, and he soon became interested in the century-old dispute over the maternal ancestry of Abraham Lincoln. Rich has done research on Nancy Hanks Lincoln's family at the University of Chicago, the Library of Congress, and in the Lincoln Collection at the Allen County Public Library in Fort Wayne, Indiana. In 2015, Rich, along with 4 colleagues, carried out a mitochondrial DNA study which resolved the dispute about Nancy Hanks' ancestry. Rich has given a talk on the study at the Conference on Illinois History at the Lincoln Presidential Library in Springfield. Some of you may be very familiar with that. And in the Lincoln at the Library lecture series at the Allen County Public Library. Rich's father grew up in Mount Pleasant, and his parents met at Iowa Wesleyan University. And you will learn Rich has many connections to this area. We are so happy Rich has decided to share some of his research with us today. So please join me in welcoming Rich Hileman.
Thank you, Madison. That was great because she covered the first 2 minutes or so of what I was going to tell you, and I can skip that part now. But I do have some cards over there on that table that have the websites for the talk I gave in Fort Wayne about the long controversy over Nancy Hanks' parentage, and the DNA study that I and 4 colleagues did, which proved who her mother actually was. The big question was whether she was a Hanks by birth or a Hanks by marriage, and the DNA supports that she was in fact a Hanks by birth, and you'll meet her by name here today. So if you take a card, you can look at that online anytime you want. And one of our group has also started her own website called geneticlincoln.com, and it has a lot of information about the Hanks family of Nancy Hanks, as well as continuing genealogical interest in genetic tests on things related to Lincoln. So you might want to check that out too. And it is true that my dad was born in Wayland, grew up in Mount Pleasant. He was very proud of having been on a Mount Pleasant Panther football team that went undefeated and unscored upon for 1 consecutive game. He always told the story. So I think we might as well get started here. We've covered most of those parts. And we'll start with what Abraham Lincoln had to say about his mother. When he was hoping to be nominated for the presidency, he wrote a short autobiography in 1859, and that's what he said at the top. My mother, who died in my 10th year, was of a family of the name of Hanks. He wrote over 100 words on his Lincoln ancestry in that same little autobiography. In 1860, after he'd been nominated, he wrote a considerably longer autobiography. So he went into a lot more detail about his mother. He actually gave her name, Nancy Hanks. He told that she was born in Virginia. And he said that she had relatives, well, of course she did, of the name of Hanks and of other names. in Coles, Macon, and Adams counties, Illinois, and also in Iowa. Then he identified John Hanks, the only cousin of his mother that he identified by name. Hanks lived in Decatur, or Macon County, Illinois at the time. This is a very striking difference in what he said about his mother and his father's families, because he really didn't know his father's family very well. He also wrote that he had met his uncle Mordecai Lincoln many times, but had never lived near him, and that he had only met his uncle Josiah Lincoln twice in his life. Yet he lived as next-door neighbors to, or even in the same homes with, members of the Hanks family of his mother until he was 21 years old. So the whole first 20 years of his life he spent living intimately with his mother's relatives, but he told nothing about them in his biographies. So now, who were the Iowans of the name of Hanks and other names who were his mother's relatives? 5 first cousins of Nancy Hanks Lincoln came to Iowa. They located in Pleasant Grove Township in Des Moines County and right across the county line in New London Township in Henry County. They were all still living when Lincoln wrote his autobiography in 1860 and mentioned them as a group also in Iowa. Before we get to them individually, I want to tell you about the Hanks family they were from and how it got from Virginia to Kentucky and then on to Illinois, Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa. Lincoln's Hanks' great-grandparents were Joseph and Ann Lee Hanks. They were both born in Richmond County in the northern neck of Virginia, which is the neck of land between the Rappahannock and Potomac rivers. Joseph Hanks was a tenant farmer there, but he also worked as a plantation overseer for wealthy neighbors. Ann Lee's father, Ann Lee was his wife, she was known as Nanny, was also a plantation overseer in Richmond County, it was called, in the northern neck. He was once accused of beating a slave to death. That was Abraham Lincoln's great-great-grandfather. Around 1782, Joseph and Ann moved further up the northern neck to a farm in what was then Hampshire County, Virginia, and is now Mineral County, West Virginia. In 1784, their daughter Lucy Hanks, right in the middle, gave birth to a daughter that she named Nancy Hanks. So that is how Lincoln's mother was of a family of the name of Hanks. And that's at least part of why he never had anything more to say about it in public. But it's not all of the reason. From Hampshire County, the Joseph Hanks family took the Wilderness Road through the Cumberland Gap into central Kentucky in 1784. At the time, the Wilderness Road was a bridle trail, too narrow for wagons. So Lucy either walked or rode a horse, carrying her infant daughter with her. Joseph and Ann first settled in Mercer County, Kentucky. Lucy would spend the rest of her life there, but her parents and siblings soon moved 30 miles west to a farm on the rolling fork of the Salt River in what is today Nelson County. It was a contiguous county to Mercer County at the time, but the counties have been divided up some today. The story exists that the young Nancy Hanks went with her grandparents to Nelson County. But there is no real evidence for this that I have been able to find or that satisfies me anyway. In Mercer County, however, where Lucy stayed, she married a man named Henry Sparrow. Can I give this to her? There we go. Married Henry Sparrow. Nancy was sometimes called Nancy Sparrow instead of Nancy Hanks, which is logical because Henry Sparrow was her stepfather after Lucy got married to him. Lucy and Henry went on to have 8 children together, 4 sons and 4 daughters, and it's because Lucy had daughters that we've been able to use DNA to prove who she was. These 4 boys and girls were half brothers and half sisters of Nancy Hanks Lincoln, Lincoln's mother. Not one of them was ever mentioned by Abraham Lincoln in print, privately, or publicly. Joseph Hanks died in 1793. Fortunately, he left a will, but unfortunately, it contributed to the controversy that existed for many years because he didn't include Lucy in it. There are 4 of these Hanks, besides Lucy, that Lincoln knew well and that are somewhat important to us. William and Elizabeth Hall, Nancy and Levi Hall. Elizabeth and Levi were brother and sister. William and Nancy, of course, were brother and sister. And Elizabeth and Thomas Sparrow. Thomas Sparrow was Henry's brother, so Lucy and Elizabeth married brothers. Nancy and William married a brother and a sister. So you had 4 Hanks siblings who married 2 pairs of siblings. Nancy, kind of like Lucy, had an illegitimate child named Dennis Hanks, who was very well known to Lincoln. And after her marriage, she had a number of children. We'll talk a little bit about Mahala Hall Beams because she came to Iowa. And we're going to be talking about Nancy Hanks Miller, Lucinda Hanks Douglas, Celia Hanks Wright, and A.J. Hanks, all of whom came to Iowa as well. So those are the 5 first cousins of Nancy Hanks Lincoln who came to Iowa. Squire Hall, who was Mahala's brother, married Matilda Johnston, who was Lincoln's stepsister after his father remarried. Dennis, these were half-brothers, Dennis married Matilda's sister, Elizabeth Johnston. So this was another pair of brothers, in this case half-brothers, marrying another pair of sisters. And Squire and Dennis became not only Lincoln's cousins, but his step-brothers-in-law. Because Dennis, I might as well add, as long as you seem to be kind of interested in this, Dennis's father, his biological father, was a man named Charles Friend, who, of course, was the brother of Jessie Friend, who Hanks married. Well, you just kind of kept it in the neighborhood in those days, I guess. How many choices were there, that kind of issue. Now, since Dennis and Squire married Lincoln's stepsisters, they pretty much spent, and their families, the rest of their lives, living near Thomas Lincoln and his second wife, Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln, because she was the mother of their wives. So they kind of stayed together, the Lincolns and Squire Hall and Dennis Hanks and their wives. All of the relatives of Lincoln's to whom he was referring when he said his mother had cousins in Iowa were children or grandchildren of Joseph and Emily Hanks. In Coles County, there were her first cousins, Dennis and Squire, and their families. In Macon County, there were most of the children of William and Elizabeth Hall, who didn't come to Iowa. There was about half of the children were there, and 4 of the children came here. And in Adams County, that Lincoln mentioned, were the children of Joseph Hanks Jr. I want to say just a word about Elizabeth Hall here, the sister of Levi and the wife of William. Her father was killed by Indians in Kentucky, just as Abraham Lincoln's grandfather was killed by Indians in Kentucky. And her mother, whose name was also Elizabeth Hall, remarried a man named Caleb Hazel. Hazel was the next door neighbor of the Lincolns when they lived on what's called the Knob Creek farm, and was one of Lincoln's 2 teachers while they lived on that farm. these cousins of Lincoln's were, of course, born in Kentucky. But Thomas Lincoln and his wife Nancy began a migration that eventually moved them all out of Kentucky, first to Indiana, then to Illinois, and some to Iowa. I just want to say something about John Hanks, who Lincoln mentioned by name. Lincoln knew both John and Dennis Hanks very well, but probably John Hanks was the one he was closest to. When he lived in New Salem, he asked John to join him in taking a flatboat down the Sangamon and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans. And in the years he practiced law, Lincoln saw John regularly, sometimes staying with him when traveling on the law circuit to cases in Decatur. He may have been invited to Lincoln's wedding. There's not clear evidence about that. If he was the only Hanks invited to Lincoln's wedding. But then Lincoln didn't invite his own father or his own stepmother to his wedding either. In 1860, John Hanks carried a fence rail into the Illinois Republican Convention, claiming it was one that he and Lincoln had split 30 years before, which gave Lincoln the nickname the Rail Splitter Candidate. When Lincoln was getting ready to leave for Washington, he wanted to go to Coles County and see his stepmother and visit his father's grave. He wrote a short note to John Hanks and said, "I'm coming by Decatur to go to Coles County. Be ready and go along." It was the last time Lincoln saw his stepmother. John was invited to and attended Lincoln's inauguration. William Herndon, who was Lincoln's law partner of 17 years, wrote of John Hanks, "Mr. Lincoln loved this man, thought him truthful, honest, and noble. Lincoln has stated this to me over and over again." At the age of 59, John Hanks enlisted in the Union Army and spent 4 years as a teamster driving wagons in the baggage train of the Illinois Volunteer Regiment, whose first commander was Ulysses S. Grant. This map shows a unit of the Lincoln Birthplace National Park. This is not the birthplace, which is southwest off the map. This is the Knob Creek Farm, it's called, where Lincoln lived from about the age 2 to the age 8. So it's the part of Kentucky he knew and actually remembered. Here's Athertonville, which Lincoln himself called Atherton's Ferry. Lincoln said he remembered the Knob Creek Farm very well. The Bardstown Road here was called the Old Cumberland Trail, and it went from Louisville to Nashville, so it was a heavily traveled road in those days. And right about here, roughly, is the Joseph Hanks Farm in Nelson County that the Joseph Hanks family settled in 1787, which is about a mile as the crow flies from the Knob Creek Farm. William and Elizabeth Hall Hanks, Levi and Nancy Hanks Hall, Thomas and Elizabeth Hanks Sparrow, all lived for much of the time that they were in Kentucky and within a few miles of this Knob Creek Farm. I put in a picture of a log cabin because you can't give a talk about Abraham Lincoln, of course, without a picture of a log cabin. This is a reconstruction at the Knob Creek Farm. It's well maintained. This is a picture of the traditional Lincoln Knob Creek cabin taken in 1903. Doesn't look as well maintained as the one they have here. And here is a picture, also from 1903, if you can believe it, of the Old Cumberland Trail, the main road between Louisville and Nashville that Lincoln lived on for 6 years. This is what the farm looks like today. It's a really pretty place to visit. It very much evokes a sense of the small rural subsistence farming that Lincoln grew up in, that his father stuck to his entire life, and that the Hanks family all lived, and they stuck to pretty much as well, until they got out of Illinois anyway, when they started getting good Iowa farmland. So here are the migrations that were started by the Lincolns. They first moved from the Knob Creek Farm to Spencer County, Indiana. They were followed the year after they moved by Elizabeth Hanks and Thomas Sparrow. Thomas Lincoln originally built a 3-sided shelter. The fourth side open to the elements, and that's what his family lived in the first winter they spent in Spencer County, Indiana. The following summer, 1817, Elizabeth Hanks and Thomas Sparrow, this is Nancy's aunt, Nancy Hanks Lincoln's aunt, they came and moved into the three-sided shelter while the Lincolns built themselves a new cabin. 1 year after that, in 1818, Elizabeth Hanks and Thomas Sparrow and Nancy Hanks Lincoln all died within 3 weeks of each other of the milk sickness. Elizabeth and Thomas had brought with them, they were unable to have their own children apparently, and they had taken in Dennis Hanks, the illegitimate son of Nancy Hanks Hall, and they had taken in Sophia Hanks, who was the illegitimate daughter of Sarah Hanks, who was a second illegitimate daughter of Lucy Hanks, a sister of Nancy Hanks Lincoln. Our DNA pretty much proves all of this. An article was written about it in 1920, and basically everybody said, that's too wild to be true, but it is true. In 1826 or so, the William and Elizabeth Hall Hanks family and the Nancy Hanks and Levi Hall family followed the Lincolns and the Sparrows to Spencer County, Indiana, and they lived there during the years that Lincoln was a teenager and during the years that most of the children of William and Elizabeth Hall Hanks, the one we'll be talking about, were middle school age, what we call today junior high age. So they were 4 to 8 years younger than Lincoln himself, but they lived as neighbors for, we don't know for sure, but in the neighborhood of 2 years or so. Then, the William and Elizabeth Hall Hanks family moved to Macon County, Illinois. John Hanks wrote back to the Lincolns and said, this is good, it's better than Indiana, you should come here. And so they did in 1830. The Lincolns loaded up and followed John Hanks' family, the William and Elizabeth Hall Hanks family, to Macon County. Lincoln and his father lived there in Macon County for 1 year. At the end of the year, Thomas Lincoln and Squire and Dennis, the families of his second wife, moved a little southeast to Coles County. Lincoln went out on his own to New Salem originally, of course, and then to Springfield, where he lived the rest of his life until he went to Washington. So, all of the William and Elizabeth Hall Hanks family, as well as Mahala Hall Beams, who, remember, Mahala was the daughter of Nancy and Levi. She'd been orphaned in 1828. So they probably went with Squire Hall and his wife, Matilda Johnston, in the Lincoln group that went on to Illinois in 1830. Squire was her guardian in Illinois. So by that point we have Mahala Hall Beams living in Macon County and all of the children of William and Elizabeth Hall Hanks living in Macon County as well. So now we get to the first cousins of Lincoln who came to Iowa. The first we're going to talk about are this is the William and Elizabeth Hall Hanks family, Nancy, who married William Miller, Lucinda, who married Thomas Douglas, Celia, who married John Dunham Wright, and Andrew Jackson, whose wife's name was Melinda Porter, all came to Iowa. Celia and her husband, Andrew Jackson, and Nancy and William Miller came to Pleasant Grove Township in Des Moines County, and Lucinda and Thomas Douglas came to New London Township right across the county line. So they still, even though they were in different counties, they lived within just a few sections of each other, just a few miles. The rest of the William and Elizabeth Hall Hanks family all continued to live in Macon County. So this is an 1870 map of the northwest corner of Pleasant Grove Township. You can see land that by this time was in the William Miller estate. But this was the land of William and Nancy Hanks Miller. various holdings of A.J. Hanks. Here's one here, another one up here. Here's another one over here. And this is what was called the Millersburg School. And this is what was called, I suppose, the Millersburg Church, neither of which are extant today. The church is on the land of A.J. Smith, who was a son-in-law of William and Nancy Hanks Miller. The school was on A.J. Hanks' land. And how well can we see? There's a little cross right here. On the estate of William Miller Sr. is the Millersburg Cemetery, where, let's just see if we can go back one. Andrew Jackson Hanks and his wife are buried. Celia Hanks is buried. And Nancy and William Miller are buried. And numerous other relatives and infant and young children of these families are buried as well. By the time of this map, Mahala Hall Beams and her husband had left Iowa, but some of her children did still live here. Celia Wright had died in 1844 in childbirth, or within about a month after giving birth to twins, and her husband moved on as well. According to a Des Moines County history, the church was incorporated as a separate Baptist church in 1858 by A.J. Hanks, Joseph Clemens, who was another son-in-law of Nancy and Nancy Hanks Miller and her husband William Miller, and by Thomas Douglas, the husband of Lucinda Hanks. According to the same Des Moines County history, Pleasant Grove is supposed to have had an early school system for the county. And in addition to the regular school year, summer schools were taught by some farmer's daughter or by a roving pedagogue who was too lazy to work on a farm. Lincoln, of course, was routinely called lazy by neighbors in Indiana and Illinois because of his interest in books and his lack of interest in farm work. So maybe that kind of prejudice was a general thing back in the 1900s when there was a lot of hard work to do on farms. Not that there isn't still. So now we'll try to get through the families that actually came here. This is a family of Nancy Hanks Miller and her husband William Miller. They located in Pleasant Grove, as we just saw. Here's something interesting too. They had a Lucretia and a Lucetta. It's not quite, this is my sister Lucretia and my other sister Lucretia, but it's getting close. And they're not the only ones of the Hanks who had, well, there's Lucinda, who we're going to be talking about. The name Lucy, which was Nancy Hanks Lincoln's mother's name, is perhaps the most popular female name in this entire Hanks family. It's really quite amazing. We know that Lincoln knew the Millers pretty well. One of the most frequently repeated stories about Lincoln from the year he spent in Macon County, 1830, was a deal he had with Nancy Hanks Miller and William Miller, where Lincoln would split 400 fence rails. 400 fence rails for 1 yard of walnut bark dyed cloth until he had enough for a pair of pants. I suppose that Nancy made the pants as well, so that was a little extra value he was getting. And one of the Miller family stories is that Nancy went further and made a coat for him and rolled it up in the pants. And when he unrolled the pants, he was surprised to find the coat. And he said, "I will split more rails for you for that." There's also a Miller family tradition that Lincoln became ill with a fever during that year, 1830, and was cared for at the William and Nancy Hanks Miller family cabin in Macon County. The best story, though, from the Miller family is in an obituary of their son Charles, right here, which claims that Lincoln was a teacher of a Miller school back in Macon County, and that he came to board with the Millers at that time. I have no idea whether this is true. But according to the obituary of Charlie, there was much curiosity on the part of the boys to see the new teacher, and it was planned to make him treat. The first day that the new teacher was to be on hand arrived. Out before him at the schoolhouse was a crowd of strapping boys headed by Miller as their captain, who had decided to lock out the teacher unless he agreed to treat. Miller was chosen captain because it was believed that, being a kinsman, he would be liable to less punishment if the plans miscarried. Lincoln reached the schoolhouse, found the door locked, but he was unable to force it. Presently, a noise was heard on the schoolhouse roof, and a few moments later, down came the sooty form of the new teacher through the chimney. He was ready to do battle despite the odds, but was no match for the young Kentuckians. Well, of course, this didn't happen in Kentucky. It's supposed to have been, but anyway. He was carried to the brink of a nearby pond where they were going to dunk him until he finally agreed to treat. Lincoln's behavior endeared him to every one of his pupils. And that is an interesting story. And there's no reason to doubt that Charles Miller did know Abraham Lincoln, but he was 2 years old in 1830. So it's a little difficult to believe that he was the leader of the strapping crowd of boys who are supposed to have kept Lincoln out of the school. On the other hand, there was indeed a Miller school in the vicinity of the Miller farm in Macon County, Illinois. Some of you will have heard this before, but it's important, and I like it. On May 11, 1864, William Miller wrote a letter to Abraham Lincoln in the White House. My dear sir, you may not recollect an old man now tottering on the verge of the grave, then living in Macon County, Illinois, who wore the name of William Miller and married your cousin, Nancy Hanks. With the keenest remembrance of old times, I will never forget your visits to my humble home, which you will recollect, although plain, was free as the air to yourself. Providence has far exceeded your expectations and mine in placing you in the great White House. Whilst age has made me feeble, when in Illinois I was so well acquainted with you that I could venture to talk to you about everything. And I hope your elevation to place has not changed your native kindness. You will perhaps recollect Aunt Nancy's sister Celia. She, you will recollect, married John D. Wright, who afterwards came to Des Moines, Iowa. John was our county surveyor and was a member of the legislature and of the state convention which formed our Constitution, and was withal a very honest, clever man. Poor Celia died about 20 years ago, when her twin children, Elisha and Electa, were 1 month old. I took them children and raised them. Elisha had a very good education and clerked in the store until the war broke out, and then he volunteered to go to the war to help Cousin Abe, as we all call you, preserve the country. Elisha is a good, sensible, honest, trustworthy boy, and has been in many hard fights, and is a good soldier. I want him to get promotion after so much fighting and suffering. He is worthy of a place in the regular army as lieutenant, and will in such position never disgrace his kinsman, who can easily give him the appointment he so richly deserves. He is a private in Company K, 19th Iowa Infantry. And Nancy is feeble like myself. She joins me in my love to you, that God will bless you in this great time of trouble. Lincoln, of course, remembered Bill Miller. Besides putting rails for him and perhaps living in his house, they had served together in the Black Hawk War. Daughters of Nancy, Hanks Miller and William Miller, married into these Pleasant Grove families: Abraham Miller, preacher Mike C., Mathis, Smith, Mathis, Hale, and Chandler. There are known photographs of Nancy Hanks Miller, but I can't find any of the good ones. So you just get this one from a newspaper article, best I can do. The second Hanks family we'll talk about is John Dunham and Celia Hanks Wright. John Wright, as William Miller said to Lincoln, did serve in the Iowa Territorial Legislature and was a Des Moines County delegate to the Iowa Constitutional Convention. He was for a time the county surveyor for Des Moines County, and he served in the same company with Lincoln in the Black Hawk War in Illinois. Elisha, down here, twin of Electa, for whom William sought a commission, was in the 19th Iowa Infantry. He volunteered when he was 18. They fought at Pea Ridge in Arkansas, the siege of Vicksburg, on campaigns in Louisiana, Texas, and Florida, and finally in the capture of a place called Spanish Fort in Alabama. On the 10th of July, 1865, 14 months after his uncle's letter to Lincoln, Elisha's regiment was mustered out in Mobile, Alabama, and was returned to Iowa as a regiment, Elisha returning home having lost the sight in his right eye. In 1869, he moved to Kansas. The Wright's son, John Dunham Wright, he's right there, just a little older than Elisha, moved to Oregon, where he lived to a ripe old age and became a sort of oracle on all things Lincoln, at least according to him. Among his claims were that his father gave Lincoln his first lessons in surveying and also gave him lessons in grammar. And Wright was a surveyor, as we know, and he also received a certificate to teach grammar as a young man in Vermont. One of Dunham Wright's statements is that after his mother died in September 1844, he was taken in by his grandparents, which would be William and Elizabeth Hall Hanks, the parents of Celia and A.J. and Lucinda and Nancy Hanks Miller, then living in Pleasant Grove Township. According to Dunham, these two old people lived on the edge of wooded land in a little one-room cabin, having but one bed and a trundle, which was my sleeping quarters. The cooking was done over the crude open grate. The evening meal was mush and milk. The dish from which I ate was a gourd, the spoon of iron, rough as though made by a blacksmith. This was a lonesome life, living with these aged people, yet I was company for them. They were typical Southern people, grandfather having fought in the Revolutionary War. There is evidence that Elizabeth Hall, the mother of these children, is also buried at Millersburg because she died during the extended time of, we don't know, anywhere from several months to a year, something like that, that the parents lived here in Pleasant Grove as well. After her death, William Hanks went back to where most of his children lived in Macon County, and that's where he died. Dunham also remembered that his father, John Wright, paid $1.25 an acre, mostly in Mexican silver coins, carried to Burlington in yarn socks, for the 80 acres of Section 33 in Pleasant Grove Township that John Wright received. Here's Dunham. Don't have a picture of Celia. She was pretty young. There was photography in 1844, but not a heck of a lot of it. But here's Dunham in front of his house out in Medical Springs, Oregon, where he ran a hotel for visitors to the hot springs there and lived to over 100. Andrew Jackson Hanks, who was known as Jack, was born in Grayson County, Kentucky. He presumably first met Lincoln when his family lived in the Lincoln neighborhood in Indiana. He would have been about 11 to 13, and Lincoln was about 17 to 19. They were about 6 years apart. One recollection of A.J. Hanks says, in 1833, he was one of a company who visited Iowa for the purpose of hunting bee trees. The writer has heard him make mention of one particular tree that was cut on this expedition, from which was extracted a barrel of honey. Having loaded their wagons with the sweetness gathered from native flowers, they returned home. At this time, the site on which the busy and prosperous city of Burlington now stands was a mountainous wilderness with but 3 huts. A frame hotel, 16 by 24 feet, was in process of construction. And going from Burlington to where Mount Pleasant has since been built, only one house could be seen on the broad expanse of prairie. All of AJ's children lived in Iowa for their lives except Caroline, who married a man named William Hawks. They moved first to Elkhart near Des Moines, and I believe he might have died there. Caroline then moved to where she had children in central Kansas, and Melinda and John Carter moved to California. The rest of the children married people with these names: McNeil, Shepard, Evans, Despain, and Matthews, and those families stayed in Des Moines or Henry County. The college has the family Bible of A.J. Hanks. Some of you may know there's been a brown bag presentation about that before. There's a little poem in it, and I'm going to read it. I don't know if that was in the presentation or not. It's called, "Of Course He Did." As I was walking out today, a little bird flew from his tree and hopped along the garden path till he came very near to me. He looked right up into my face and bobbed his cunning head. I thought that he was going to sing, but "sweet, sweet, sweet" was all he said. "Sweet, sweet, sweet," he said again. Then up into the tree he went. I wonder what he said it for. Now, do you think it was me he meant? On the back of the poem is the name Maggie Hanks, who married a man named Ball, and she and her husband, I don't remember their family, they lived all of their lives in Pleasant Grove Township or in New London, that general neighborhood. A.J. Hanks eventually accumulated close to a section of land in Pleasant Grove. He was an incorporator of the Church at Millersburg, helped finance its construction, provided ground for the Middleburg School, we've already seen. His wife died in 1856, the mother of all his children, Melinda Porter. So he married again a widow of Danville named Sophia Rowe, and with her 6 children at home, and his 6 children at home, they had an even dozen. She died eventually while he was still alive, and he married a 3rd time, another widow named Milka Moran. This didn't work out so well. A.J. died August 15, 1889, and 2 weeks earlier, he put a notice in the Burlington Gazette. "This is to certify that my wife, Milka Hanks, has this day left my bed and board without any provocation whatever, and I hereby warn all persons whatsoever against trusting her on my account." The tradition is that A.J. weighed 300 pounds and that his funeral was held outdoors in a grove of trees because his casket was too wide to fit through the door of the church. Oops, went too far, too fast there. So here he is with Melinda Porter, and here he is a little later with his children. The college has a clean, original copy of this photograph, but I picked this one off the internet because it's annotated. The identifications of the children are correct, but up in the left-hand corner, you'll see that it says that A.J. Hanks' father and the mother of Abraham Lincoln were brother and sister. This is not true. A.J.'s father and the grandmother of Abraham Lincoln were brother and sister. But this mistake was invented in about 1900, and it was received with such enthusiasm that it was carved into the marble of the temple that surrounds the supposedly reconstructed birthplace cabin of Abraham Lincoln at the National Historical Park birthplace in Kentucky. And that same mistake has appeared as recently in 2009 in a major biography of Lincoln. The 4th child of William and Elizabeth Hanks Hall to move to Iowa was Lucinda and her husband Thomas Douglas. Mary Elizabeth here married a Jordan who was local. They have some small children buried in Millersburg. But this entire family, except for Margaret Ann and Frederick Lee, eventually left Iowa. The Douglases moving all the way to California. Margaret and Frederick Lee died within 10 days of each other in 1857 in their 20s, and they are buried in Farrell Cemetery, northeast of New London. They had a 1-year-old son at the time, Alan Lee. He stayed here, I suppose with Lee relatives, because when he was about 13, his parents and the rest of his family went to California. He married and had a family, and Alan Lee is buried in Pleasant Grove Cemetery over by the town of Pleasant Grove. All of these families, although in California, did have children, except Louise down here. She was living with her father when he died, and 11 months later, Louise's brother Green applied for Louise to be admitted to the California Home for the Care and Training of Feeble-Minded Children. Louise was 40. Louise, who was born in New London Township in 1852, lived the next 29 years of her life until her death in what became known as the Sonoma Home. In 1905, the writer Jack London bought a ranch he named Wonder Ranch, which joined the grounds of the Sonoma State Home. Some of the residents reportedly did work for him on his ranch. Louise was still living at the home in 1914 when Jack London wrote a short story called Told in the Drooling Board. Here is Lucinda Hanks Douglas, looking about the age she would have been when they lived in Iowa, I would guess, but it could have been in California too. So the fifth first cousin of Nancy Hanks Lincoln to move to Des Moines County was Mahala Hall Beams, the half-sister of Dennis Hanks. They came to Pleasant Grove Township as well in about 1836, probably with William and Nancy Hanks Miller and Celia and John Dunham Wright. They moved eventually to northwest Missouri, but their daughter Martha stayed. She married a man named Milton Despain, and their son Joel stayed, marrying Mary Ann Priest. Joel's and Mary Ann's daughter Martha Isabel married Martha and Milton's son Despain Jr., so these were first cousins marrying each other, and all of those Despain families stayed in Des Moines or Henry County. Here are William and Mahala Hall Beams. This one, I think, was certainly during the time that they lived in Iowa. And here's Mahala later in life, probably after moving to Missouri. The 5 first cousins of Nancy Hanks Lincoln who moved to Iowa are long gone, but not all of their descendants. Besides the ones who were named Hanks, Miller, Wright, Beams, or Douglas, their daughters and granddaughters of the Lincoln relatives, also in Iowa, married into Des Moines and Henry County families named Miller, C., Mathis, Albert, Ball, Matthews, Thomas, Smith, Lincoln, Clemens, Hale, Hileman, Chandler, Seymour, Ward, Larkin, Oberman, Thompson, Hawks, McNeil, Shepard, Despain, Carter, Lee, Jordan, Putnam, Conkey, Fleenor, Willie, Tackenberg, Turkington, Williams, Lotto, Willis, Billings, Thornburg, Hill, Shipley, Linden, Michaels, Obermeyer, Redfern, Ritchie, Stafford, Taft, Bonar. And I'm sure there are more, but you get the idea. So thanks very much.